Welcome back. All right, for this video, I'm opting to wear my Hamilton Bulldogs jersey. I like it a lot. I'm wearing a Penguins hat because it's the same color scheme. But yeah, I like the logo. Not a bad jersey. OHL, all that fun stuff. So I wanted to talk about last summer's power rankings that I did. August the 1st last year, I did a power rankings. And it's fun to do this over the summer. I intend to do it again on August the 1st. And this power rankings reminds me of what I need to be careful of this time out. First off, Boston. So I'm not going to go through this necessarily all in order. But first off, Boston. They were coming off of a year they were 10th. They were handled in the first round by Carolina, and they were going to be missing a lot of players to start the season. McAvoy, I don't think Bergeron started the season with them. They were without Marchand. And I just felt like, well, Boston's in deep trouble. This is a team that's going to have a lot of trouble winning out of the gate. So I had them down at 25th on the board because I felt like to start the season they were going to be handicapped in what they could do. Not that they'd stay there, and that's the trick, right? Is over the summer you're kind of going, okay, where these teams are right now, and looking at injuries, this is what I think is going to happen. I definitely overcorrected. They ended up finishing first. Of course, they lost in the first round to Florida, thus the panic index magnet right here. Now, the jumping up and down Donald Duck, that's for New Jersey because I dramatically underestimated New Jersey. They were coming off of a season where they've been 28th overall, and I had them 27th on that power ranking. They ended up finishing third in the NHL this past season. They moved up 25 spots, and they lost in the second round against Carolina. The other panic magnet right here is because I got Seattle completely wrong. The funny thing is, I had them at 24th. They'd actually finished the season 30th. And I remember feeling like, maybe I'm overestimating the jump for these guys a little bit. But I like the additions. I think they're going to be better. They ended up being 12th, and they lost in the second round against Dallas. Then you've got Vancouver. I predicted 16th. They had actually finished 18th the year before. And under Bruce Boudreau, things were going really well after he was hired. And then, nope. To start the season, it was a giant no. So they ended up finishing 22nd overall in the standings, which, that's kind of the Canucks way. They dropped from 18th to 20th in the overall standings. And yet, is there optimism right now in Vancouver that the team's going to get better and maybe make the playoffs? There is. I'm not there. They've alienated me from that perspective. But anyways, that's where we're at. And then one of the biggest drops, too, is St. Louis. They had finished 9th that year, and I actually had them 8th on the power rankings. They lost in the second round against Colorado. They gave Colorado everything they could handle. They ended up finishing 23rd this past season, and clearly are in the midst of a rebuild / retool, however you want to look at it. Now, number one was Colorado, which makes sense. They'd won the Stanley Cup. Your Cup winner should be number one on your power rankings during the summer. And what's interesting is that, of course, they ended up finishing 6th this past season and lost in the first round against Seattle. But I had Florida at number 2 on last summer's power rankings, even though they had lost in the second round against Tampa Bay. But they had been first overall in the standings, and I felt like Florida was still coming into their own. What's funny is they then finished 17th in the standings and go all the way to the final. So technically they weren't in the top half of the NHL teams by the season's end, but because they're in the East, they make the playoffs, and they got to the final this year after getting to the second round the year before. For Tampa Bay, they had been 8th. I had them at 3rd. They ended up finishing 13th, and they lost in the first round to Toronto. It does feel like Tampa Bay is getting further away from the Cup, not closer to it. Carolina, I had 4th. They ended up finishing 2nd, lost in the conference final. And they'd been 3rd the year before. Edmonton, I had 5th. They ended up finishing 7th, lost in the second round against Vegas. I had the Rangers at 6th. They ended up being 9th overall. And the conference finalists the year before, they lost in the first round this year, of course. For the Toronto Maple Leafs, they finished 4th in the standings. I had them at 7th. And then this past season, they were 5th. So Toronto, top 5 team, probably, yes, adding Bertuzzi and Domi. And again, that's just for the regular season too, right? We're not getting into playoffs, because that's the one thing. The power rankings, I don't do them during the playoffs because that's a totally different beast. But for regular season power rankings, Toronto will definitely be top row. Got into St. Louis, so we'll go into Calgary. They had been 6th last year. They got to the second round where they lost against the Oilers. They ended up finishing 16th this season. So I had them at 9th on the board, but they ended up 16th and missed the playoffs. Minnesota was 11th and made the playoffs. I had them at 10th on the board during the summer. And so they ended up losing in the first round against Dallas this season. Last season, it was against St. Louis in the first round. LA I had at 11th on the board. They ended up being 10th overall in the standings. Lost in the first round against Edmonton, as they had the year before as well, where they were 14th. So for LA, they've moved up in the standings, the same with the Oilers. And, it definitely feels like one or the other could very well be due for at least a Stanley Cup final run. Pittsburgh had been 12th in the standings. I had them at 12th on the board. They ended up 20th overall this past season and missed the playoffs. So the first team that misses the playoffs on the board is St. Louis. The second team is Pittsburgh. Then you've got Dallas. Dallas had been 15th the prior season. I had them at 13th on the board. They ended up 8th this past season, and they lost in the conference finals against Vegas. Washington, they ended up 13th that previous season. I had them at 14th on the board, and they ended up 25th this past season, no playoffs. Nashville, I had 15th. They'd been 16th. They ended up 18th. So right in that range. Nashville, not far off from, a playoff team this past season, but clearly with the moves made in the offseason, playoffs likely aren't in the offing for 2024. I got into Vancouver, so we'll talk about Columbus. Columbus, 17th where I had them. They'd been 21st the year before, and I thought adding Johnny Gaudreau, adding Goodbranson to the blue line, I thought that would solidify the third pairing, honestly. And I felt like Columbus was a dark horse to end up in the playoffs. Instead, they were 31st. Nightmare season from the beginning. Vegas, I had 18th. They'd actually been 17th in the standings. I absolutely underestimated having everybody healthy, what that would do for them. They ended up being 4th overall and won the Stanley Cup. For Winnipeg, I had them at 19th. They had finished the season 19th this past year. They actually finished 14th, and they lost in the first round to Vegas. The Islanders I had at 20th. They'd finished the season 20th. They actually ended up 15th this past season and lost in the first round against Carolina. For the Sens, I had them at 21st. They ended up finishing 21st. So that's where they ended up finishing. Detroit, I had 22nd. They actually finished at 24th. So the Sens go from 26th to 21st. Detroit goes from 25th to 24th. Again, if these teams get better at the same rate they have been, they're going to be in the mix for the playoffs really late in the season. Ottawa could get there, but Buffalo's going to try to stop them. I had Buffalo at 23rd on the board. They actually finished the season 19th overall. I mentioned Seattle. I mentioned Boston. So San Jose, I had them at 22nd. They finished, or 26th. They ended up 29th, and they had been 22nd the year before. I've talked about New Jersey. So for Anaheim, I had them at 28th, even though they'd finished the previous season at 23rd. I seem to remember Anaheim fans being kind of like, wait, we already had our bad years. Well, they finished 32nd. Philadelphia, they finished the season 29th. I had them 29th on the board. They actually ended up 26th this year, so they proved me wrong. Montreal, I had at 30th. They had finished at the bottom of the league that previous season. They ended up 28th. And then Arizona, I had at 31st. They'd finished the season in 31st. They actually ended up 27th this past season. And finally, Chicago, I had at the bottom of the board. They had been 27th the year before, and this year they actually ended up 30th, thanks to that win over Pittsburgh. And of course, we know if they had lost that game against Pittsburgh, they don't get Bedard. Pittsburgh makes the playoffs. Florida doesn't make the playoffs. Dogs and cats living together. Anyways, I'm going to go right into the whole Bill Murray thing from Ghostbusters. And then I'm going to be sad because a lot of people watching this be like, I don't get the reference. I'm so old. Anyways, there you go. So that's where it was last summer, and I am taking that into consideration. One thing I'm doing this summer as well, which I didn't do last year, is basically build a power rankings from scratch. And so I don't expect it to be highly accurate. That's kind of the fun of it. But it is interesting to see where teams ended up in comparison to where I had them on the power rankings during the previous summer. So there you go. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.